A man wakes up at 5:30 inches the morning, not because he wants to, but because he has to. He drinks his coffee black. No time for breakfast. Checks his bank account before he even checks the news. It's lower than it should be. Again, he did everything right. Got the degree, took the job, worked the extra hours, saved when he could, avoided stupid risks, and somehow, he's still falling behind. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, quietly, constantly, like something is leaking beneath the surface. Now here's the uncomfortable question. How do you fail when you never broke the rules? Because that's what this is. It feels like failure, but it doesn't look like failure. He's not unemployed. He's not reckless. He's not lazy. He's exhausted. And he's not alone. Millions of Americans are living this exact life right now, doing everything they were told would lead to stability, and ending up with anxiety instead. At first glance, it looks like a personal problem, a budgeting issue, a discipline issue. But here's the part nobody talks about. What if the system itself quietly changed, but the instructions never did? Think about it. For decades, the formula was simple. Work hard, earn stability, build a life. But something strange happened along the way. The effort stayed the same. In many cases, it increased. But the outcome started shrinking. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because when outcomes shrink, but expectations stay the same, people don't blame the system. They blame themselves. They think, I should be doing better. I must have made a mistake. Maybe I'm just not good enough. So they push harder. They optimize. They hustle. They sacrifice sleep, relationships, peace of mind. But the gap doesn't close. It widens. And here's the contradiction that should stop you in your tracks. How can an entire generation feel like they're failing when they're working harder than ever? That's not normal. That's not random. That's a pattern. And patterns don't come from individuals. They come from systems. But systems don't announce when they stop working. They don't send a notification saying, hey, just so you know, the rules have changed. No. They let you keep playing. And slowly, they let you lose. Now imagine living inside that without realizing it. You keep trying to win a game that was quietly redesigned to be unwinnable. And the scariest part? You start measuring your worth based on how well you're doing in it. That's where the real damage begins. Not financial, psychological. Because once people internalize systemic failure as personal failure, they don't just lose money. They lose clarity. They lose confidence. They lose themselves. And if you've ever had that quiet moment, late at night, staring at your ceiling, wondering how you did everything right, and still feel like you're slipping, then you already understand this story. You're just not hearing it talked about honestly. Not yet. And maybe that's why conversations like this matter. Not for answers. Not yet. But for something more important. Recognition. Because the moment you realize, this isn't just you, everything starts to shift. There's a moment that keeps repeating across the country. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trend. But it's happening everywhere. Someone sits in their car, engine off, just staring ahead. Not because they're lost, because they're doing the math. Rent, insurance, groceries, gas, student loans, maybe a credit card balance quietly growing in the background. The numbers don't look catastrophic, but they don't work either. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. These aren't irresponsible people. These are nurses, teachers, engineers, office workers, people with degrees, careers, and routines. People who followed the blueprint exactly as it was handed to them. So why does it feel like they're constantly one step away from falling apart? At first, you might think, costs went up, that's all. But that explanation is too simple. Because what's happening isn't just inflation. It's something deeper. It's structural. Let's rewind for a second. There was a time when stability didn't require perfection. You could make a few mistakes, take a few risks, even drift a little, and still land on your feet. Today, there's no margin, no cushion, no room to breathe. Everything has to go right, all the time. And even then, it might not be enough. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because when survival requires near-perfect execution, life stops feeling like life and starts feeling like maintenance. You're not building. You're not exploring. You're managing risk, managing costs, managing stress. And slowly, without realizing it, your entire existence becomes about not falling behind, not getting ahead, just not falling. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. That's not stability. That's controlled instability. It looks stable on the outside. Paychecks come in, bills get paid, the routine continues. But underneath, there's tension, constant, low-level tension, like a tightrope stretched across your entire life. And you can't step off, because stepping off means losing everything you worked for. So you keep balancing, carefully, quietly, and alone. Now here's where the psychological shift happens. When people live in constant pressure, they start adapting to it. They normalize it. They tell themselves, this is just adulthood. This is how it's supposed to feel. But it's not. It wasn't always like this. And that matters. Because if something feels off, if something feels heavier than it should, there's usually a reason, not a personal reason, a systemic one. And once you see that, something interesting happens. The anxiety doesn't disappear, but it starts to make sense. It's no longer this vague internal failure. It becomes a signal, a response to an environment that demands more than it gives back. And this is where a lot of people are right now, caught between two narratives. One that says, work harder, fix yourself, and another that quietly whispers, something about this doesn't add up. That second voice, it's easy to ignore, because listening to it means questioning everything, the rules, the expectations, the definition of success itself. And that's not comfortable, but it is necessary, because if the game has changed, continuing to play it the same way isn't resilience, it's self-destruction. And maybe that realization, that quiet, unsettling awareness, is the beginning of something bigger. Note, a solution. Not yet, but a shift, a different way of seeing. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. If this is hitting closer than expected, if it feels like someone just put words to something you couldn't quite explain, that's not accidental. That's recognition. And those are the conversations worth sticking around for. There's a phrase people don't use anymore. Not because it disappeared, but because it quietly stopped being true. You'll be better off than your parents. For a long time, that wasn't just hope. It was an expectation, a kind of unspoken contract. Each generation would climb a little higher, earn a little more, struggle a little less. But here's the part nobody wants to confront. For millions of Americans, that contract didn't just weaken. It broke. And it didn't break loudly. There was no single moment, no announcement, just a slow shift. Wages stopped keeping up, costs kept climbing, assets became harder to reach, homes turned into investments instead of shelter, education turned into debt before it became opportunity. And suddenly, the path forward started looking crowded. But here's where things get uncomfortable. Because when upward mobility stalls, the narrative doesn't change with it. People are still told, push harder, stay disciplined, success is still there. So they keep climbing. But the ladder? It's not standing on the same ground anymore. At first, this looks like a motivation problem, but it isn't. It's a structural shift, hiding behind motivational language. And that creates something dangerous. A gap between effort and outcome. You can feel it. Two people working equally hard, getting completely different results. Not because one is smarter, not because one is more deserving, but because timing, access, and starting position now matter more than we admit. And this is where the story starts to fracture. Because if success isn't just about effort, then what does that say about failure? That question makes people uncomfortable. So instead of answering it, we avoid it. We simplify things. We turn complex systems into personal stories. He didn't try hard enough. She made bad choices. Clean explanations. Comfortable explanations. But incomplete. Because they ignore the invisible variables. The rising floor of entry, the shrinking margin for error, the increasing cost of simply existing. And once you start seeing those variables, you can't unsee them. You notice how everything feels just slightly out of reach. Not impossible, just delayed. A house? Maybe later. Savings. Eventually. Peace of mind? Someday. And that word someday starts carrying a lot of weight. Because someday keeps moving. Every year, it shifts a little further away, and people adjust. They delay milestones, redefine success, lower expectations, not because they want to, but because they have to. And over time, something subtle happens. The dream doesn't disappear. It gets resized, more modest, more cautious, more realistic, but also more fragile. And this is where the psychological toll deepens. Because humans are wired to move forward, to feel progress, to believe that effort leads somewhere. When that link weakens, it creates a kind of quiet disorientation. You're moving, but you're not arriving. And that disconnect, it's exhausting. Not physically, existentially. Now here's the part most people don't say out loud. When a system makes progress feel uncertain, people don't just lose motivation. They lose trust. Trust in the path. Trust in the promise. Trust in the future they were told to believe in. And without trust, everything starts to feel heavier. Decisions become harder. Risks feel riskier. Even hope becomes complicated. But here's the shift. The moment you recognize that this isn't just about individual choices, you start asking better questions. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what changed? And that question, that's where clarity begins. Because once you stop assuming the problem is purely personal, you open the door to seeing the system for what it is. Not broken in an obvious way, but misaligned, out of sync with the reality people are living in. And that realization, it doesn't fix everything, but it does something just as important. It gives you back your perspective. And in a world where confusion is constant, that might be the most valuable thing you can have. There's a quiet shift that happens when people stop believing the system will catch them. They don't announce it. They don't protest it. They just start playing differently. Less risk, less trust, less long-term thinking, and more survival. Because when the future feels uncertain, the present becomes everything. You start prioritizing what's immediate, what's guaranteed, what's safe. And that sounds rational. But here's the part nobody talks about. When millions of people start thinking this way at the same time, it changes the entire culture. People stop taking big swings, stop starting businesses, stop relocating for opportunity. Not because they lack ambition, but because the margin for failure is gone. One wrong move isn't a setback anymore. It's a collapse. And when failure becomes catastrophic, risk becomes irrational. So people stay where they are, even if where they are isn't working. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because a system that punishes failure this harshly doesn't just limit outcomes, it limits imagination. People don't just lower their expectations. They stop imagining alternatives altogether. They settle into patterns. Predictable, controlled, safe, but also constrained. Now zoom out. What happens when an entire generation starts optimizing for safety instead of growth? Innovation slows. Mobility decreases. Opportunity concentrates. And suddenly, the system becomes even harder to move within. It's a feedback loop. Less risk, less opportunity, more caution, even less mobility. And it doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like normal life, which makes it even more dangerous. Because when something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. Now here's where the psychological layer deepens. People aren't just adapting financially. They're adapting emotionally. They're becoming more guarded, more anxious, more transactional. Relationships start carrying economic weight. Friendships revolve around shared stress. Conversations shift from dreams to coping strategies. Did you refinance? Are you cutting back? Is it even worth it anymore? And beneath those conversations, there's something heavier, a quiet grief. Not for what was lost, but for what never fully arrived. The life that was expected, but keeps getting postponed. And here's the part that hits hardest. When expectations collapse slowly, people don't always realize they're grieving. They just feel tired, unmotivated, restless, disconnected, like something important is missing, but they can't quite name it. And because they can't name it, they internalize it. They assume it's burnout, or stress, or just part of growing up. But it's more than that. It's the emotional cost of a system that no longer delivers what it promised. And that cost doesn't show up on a paycheck. It shows up in energy, in attention, in the quiet moments where people question everything. Now here's where things shift again. Because once enough people feel this way, the story starts to change. Not publicly, not immediately, but internally, people begin to detach. Not completely, but enough to start questioning, is this really the only way to live? And that question? It's subtle, but powerful, because it breaks something open. The assumption that the current system is the only system, that the current path is the only path. And once that assumption cracks, new possibilities start to emerge. Not clearly, not all at once, but gradually. And maybe that's where we are right now. Not at the end of something, but in the early stages of realizing that something needs to change. Not just individually, collectively. And if you've been feeling that quiet tension, that sense that the rules don't quite match reality anymore, you're not imagining it. You're noticing something real. And noticing is where every shift begins. So what happens next? That's the question everyone wants answered. But here's the truth most people won't say out loud. There isn't going to be a single moment where everything suddenly makes sense again. No reset button, no clean fix, no announcement that the system has been corrected. That's not how shifts like this work. They don't arrive all at once. They unfold, quietly, unevenly, through millions of small decisions, made by people who are starting to see things differently. And this is where the story changes. Not because the system suddenly improves, but because people stop relating to it the same way. They start redefining success, not as accumulation, but as stability, not as status, but as autonomy, not as winning the game, but as choosing which games are worth playing at all. And that shift? It's subtle, but it's powerful, because once you stop chasing a definition of success that no longer reflects reality, you create space for something more honest, more grounded, more sustainable. But here's the part that gets complicated. This kind of shift doesn't feel like progress at first. It feels like letting go of timelines, letting go of expectations, letting go of comparisons that were never fair to begin with. And that can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting, because for so long, people have been taught to measure their lives using external markers, income, home ownership, career titles. But what happens when those markers become harder and harder to reach? Do you keep chasing them at the cost of your well-being? Or do you step back and ask a different question? What actually matters now? That question doesn't have a universal answer. And that's the point. Because once people start answering it for themselves, instead of inheriting it from a system, something shifts internally. They begin to prioritize differently: time over status, flexibility over appearance, peace over performance. Not because they've given up, but because they've recalibrated. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. That's not failure. That's adaptation. But adaptation doesn't mean acceptance. It doesn't mean people stop noticing the flaws. If anything, they notice them more clearly than ever. The rising costs, the shrinking margins, the imbalance between effort and outcome. But instead of internalizing those flaws, they contextualize them. They see them for what they are: structural realities, not personal shortcomings. And that distinction, it changes everything. Because once you stop carrying systemic problems as individual burdens, you reclaim something important: your sense of proportion, your sense of agency, your ability to move through the world without constantly questioning your own worth. And maybe that's the quiet turning point in all of this. Not a dramatic revolution, but a gradual awakening, a collective realization that says, we're not broken. The model we were given just doesn't fit anymore. And from that realization, new conversations begin. More honest ones, less performative, less filtered. Conversations about trade-offs, about priorities, about what kind of life is actually sustainable in a world that feels increasingly unstable. And if you've made it this far, there's a good chance something in this story felt familiar. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. And maybe that's why these conversations matter. Not to give you easy answers, but to give you clarity. Because clarity doesn't fix everything, but it does something just as important. It helps you see where you actually stand. And from there, you can decide what comes next. Not based on outdated expectations, but based on reality. your reality. And if more people start doing that, quietly, individually, honestly, then maybe the future doesn't come from the system fixing itself. Maybe it comes from people, no longer pretending it already works. And if that idea, that quiet shift in perspective, is something you've been feeling but couldn't quite put into words, then stay close to conversations like this. Because sometimes, the most important thing is simply realizing you're not the only one seeing it. And maybe the most important shift isn't when the system changes. It's when you stop seeing yourself through it. Because the moment you realize that this game no longer works the way you were told it would, something subtle begins to happen. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes that were never fully in your control. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to breathe again. Enough to recognize that falling behind doesn't always mean you're moving too slowly. Sometimes, it means the finish line was moved. And that realization, quiet, almost invisible, is where everything begins to realign. Because once you step outside that loop of try harder, optimize more, push further, you gain something most people never realize they've lost: perspective. You begin asking different questions. Not, what am I doing wrong? But, what am I measuring myself against? And that question changes everything, because it forces you to confront something uncomfortable, that many of the goals you've been chasing were never entirely yours. They were inherited, absorbed, presented as the only definition of success. But in a world that has fundamentally shifted, holding on to those definitions can quietly break you. So maybe the answer isn't to push harder toward outcomes that feel increasingly out of reach. Maybe it's to step back and decide what actually matters now, not in theory, not culturally, but personally. And that doesn't mean disengaging from life. It means engaging with it more honestly, choosing what's worth your energy, what's worth your time, what's worth the cost, and just as importantly, what isn't. Because once you stop chasing everything, you can finally see what's real. And that shift, small as it feels, has consequences. Because when enough people begin to think this way, something larger starts to move. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. The system doesn't just change from the top down. It changes when people stop participating in it the same way, when they stop equating survival with success, when they stop confusing exhaustion with achievement, and when they begin quietly, individually, to redefine what a life well lived actually looks like. So if something in this story felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not a coincidence. That's recognition. And recognition matters, because it's the first step towards seeing clearly. And clarity, even without immediate solutions, is powerful. It grounds you. It steadies you. It reminds you that you're not alone in this. And maybe that's why conversations like this exist. Not to give you perfect answers, but to help you see the landscape for what it really is, so that whatever comes next, you're not walking into it blindly. And if this perspective, this way of looking at things, is something that helped you put words to what you've been feeling, then stay close to conversations like this. Because sometimes, the most important realization is this: you're not broken. You're responding to something real. And once you see that, you can finally start choosing what comes next.